distinguished invitees, friends. It's a pleasure for me to participate in this prestigious India Today Conclave. And thank you for giving me the honor of being part of this event. Much has been spoken at this conclave and elsewhere about the Asian century. Policymakers, academics, the media and experts in their respective fields continue to dwell at length whether the 21st century will be dominated by Asian politics and culture, and as to how leadership can be given to achieve such an outcome for the benefit of our region. It is in this context that this panel has been tasked with deliberating the topic of whether dynasty is a burden or a boon in South Asia, a region which has a vital role to play in the unfolding Asian century. We need to focus our attention to this subject from another perspective as well, that is the unfolding Asian century. Asia has emerged as a global powerhouse. The advanced economies no longer look at Asia as poverty-stricken land with famine and misery. Further, the leading economies in the world today are geographically connected in Asia. I come from a country which suffered immensely from brutal terrorism for nearly 3 decades. The suffering undergone by our people cannot be quantified. Although my country was one of the pioneering Asian economies in removing barriers to global trade, investment, and financing, in order to become a vibrant global partner in economic development, it could not exploit its fullest potential, owing to terrorism that crippled our society's fabric and economic fundamentals. Since November 2005, my country, under the visionary leadership of President Mahinda Rajpaksa, who hails from a deep-rooted politically and culturally rich family, with an affiliation to political activism in human rights, trade unions, and rural farmers, embarked on an economic development strategy, laying a foundation for rapid development within the global framework. Today, 7 years after President Rajpaksa has assumed in office, Sri Lanka enjoys a relatively sophisticated all-island infrastructure network. This has been possible primarily due to the ending of 30 years-long conflict under his administration. This has enabled him to unify the country on a single platform theme, that is rapid, inclusive development along with equal access to development opportunities in the country. His administration has paved the way for people to be able to express their views in a free and democratic Sri Lanka. His government has resettled almost all displaced people with adequate livelihood support. The Government of India, among other bilateral and multilateral development partners, played a pivotal role in this effort by extending generous support for infrastructure development and resettlement initiatives in the affected areas. Sri Lanka has witnessed over 8% growth for 2 consecutive years, following 6% annual growth over the first 5-year period ending 2009, and remains buoyant for the 3rd consecutive year, despite global economic uncertainty. All economic fundamentals remain favorable. Food security has been ensured, with the country being able to generate surplus of rice production. Highest priority has been accorded to promote energy security as well. It has embarked on a rapid development process in export, production of goods and services. Complementing the key sectors in the economy, country's comparative advantage in the port and aviation sector is being fully exploited, with the development of new port and airport in the south of the country, while also developing other ports and airports in the country to ensure global connectivity in trade, aviation, and tourism. Overall, the development strategy of Sri Lanka aimed to raise the country's per capita income, around 4,000 US dollars by 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, despite all economic fundamentals shifting in favor of Asia, our countries are unique in one sense. We all have long-standing culture and traditional values. In transformation towards a modern world must be navigated while preserving of the two fundamental principles. One is the preservation of our culture, traditions, and the value system, which will nurture us in a multiple framework with mutual respect, care, love, and compassion. The other is the conservation of our environment. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm the youngest parliamentarian in the parliament elected in 2010. I'm proud of this achievement for another reason. My father too was the youngest member in the 1970 parliament of Sri Lanka and as a lawyer like myself. Coincidentally, a cousin of my father had also been the youngest to enter parliament in his time. Before my father, my grandfather, his brother, and his children too had entered parliament, beginning their public service from as far back as 1936. In that sense, I represent the third generation of politicians of the Rajpaksas. Friends, all of us have had to contest in highly competitive elections to enter parliament. I'm also proud that I have entered politics in an era that my country enjoys expressways, aviation ports hubs, IT-based activities, buoyant tourism, new generation banking and financing, and a strong construction industry providing support for growth. Our country envisages a sports economy and a knowledge-based economy, reflecting synergies of new aspiration of my generation. I believe that the distinguished panelists would agree that one's success or failure in politics in a democracy where regular elections are held depends largely on how one chooses to chart on his own course. Merely belonging to a political family will not ensure that one would succeed in politics continuously, especially in a present context of an active media and even more active civil society. Democracy, as you all know, is a form of governance with specific institutions and a state governed by elected representatives. A dynasty, in contrast, typically denotes a series of rulers who belong to the same family, or a succession of powerful people from the same family, according to the rules of that family. In a functioning democracy, my friends, representatives are elected by the vote of the people for a specific term. Therefore, merely by belonging to a family of politicians, one does not inherit office through succession. One of the common benefits of being part of a political family, although short-lived, is the comparative ease, perhaps, of being able to receive nomination from a party to contest election. But the reason I say that this is a short-lived benefit is because although one may win an election the first time around, there is no absolute guarantee of re-election. The decision lies in the hands of the people. As a young person, I felt strongly and passionately that as a member of a political family, I could play a useful, important, and meaningful role in giving voice to the youth of our country, revive their dreams, engage in nation building, and healing our fractured land. I want to see the youth of my country rise to rebuild our nation and to strengthen institutions that are essential for democracy, that have become weakened as a result of the conflict. Our dream is to see youth of our country strive towards excellence in all fields and demands no less than the best from the public service. This window of opportunity must be seized by our youth to take the country onto a different path, to build a nation that is robust and resilient. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, let me reiterate the theme of the India Today Conclave. A nation century securing the global promise. We in Sri Lanka are gearing for this century, a century of promise for one new generation. The gratitude we could show our parents and grandparents for sacrifices made during their lifetime is to preserve our heritage, culture, value system, and environment. I hope this conclave will propagate the new vision of Asia for greater collaboration, partnership, and unity. Thank you.
Can I now invite Sajib Wazit? He's joining us on a special day. This is his grandfather, the father of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's 92nd birthday today. Thank you for being at the conclave, Sajib.
Thank you very much, Saurabh, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today to address all of you. I usually don't make too many public appearances, so it's certainly a unique experience for me. The topic we have at hand is one that I've had to deal with most of my life. It is a question that gets asked all the time. Are political dynasties a burden or a boon? This question was brought up while we were chatting before we came in here, and my response always has been that, well, it is typical that the son of a doctor or a lawyer goes into that profession because it is what they know, it is what they see, it is what they feel comfortable with. I have to confess here, I did not take after my politician mother first. I actually took after my father and went into engineering. My father was a nuclear physicist. Politics is something I became involved in much later in life, and I would like to share a little bit of that story with you tonight. But first, to address our question, I believe Bangladesh is a classic textbook case study on whether a political dynasty is a burden or a boon. You see, in Bangladesh, unlike most other countries, we have not one but two political dynasties. You see, we decided that we had to better India in something besides cricket. After yesterday's victory, I just had to mention that. So the contrast, to look at whether a political dynasty can help or hurt a country, you have the two political dynasties, the contrast between the two political dynasties in Bangladesh. One, of course, is my family. My grandfather got involved in politics from an early age. He was involved in student politics. He became a member of parliament. He became a minister in the Pakistani government, led the independence movement, suffered many, many years in Pakistani jail, and ultimately led our people to freedom. My mother herself had gotten involved in student politics because of our independence movement. After independence, she went back to her studies, to being a housewife, to raising kids. And all that changed, unfortunately, as it often does in our subcontinent, because of tragic circumstances. My mother came back to politics many years later to lead the fight against a military dictatorship. She spent, and I remember those days, I was young, I was 10 years old when she came back to Bangladesh. And we spent many, many years waiting, hoping, fighting for a change, for freedom. Bangladesh those days was a very, very different country. You had a state of emergency, no rights, no democracy. There was a nightly curfew, so you could not go out at night. There was no nightlife. You had Section 144, where you could not gather in public in groups of 4 or more, or you could be arrested. You did not go to the police, and you were certainly afraid of the military because you might disappear. At the time, the hope of freedom, just to be able to express your rights, democracy seemed like a distant dream. But my mother never gave up. She stayed on the course, she kept fighting, and ultimately, she succeeded. There were good times as well. It wasn't all bad. As a child, when I was 12, 13, the military dictators decided, instead of taking my mother away when they would arrest her, they decided to put her under house arrest. And as kids, we actually liked that, because then we got mother's undivided attention. She didn't have meetings, she didn't have phone calls, she didn't have people to come and see her. So I'm sure my mother doesn't share our view. Now, the contrast that I would like to draw is with the other political dynasty in Bangladeshi politics. I'm sure you've all heard about it. The rivalry between the two families and the two political parties is legendary. But I would like to bring to your attention the contrast. The other political family was founded by our first military dictator. He created his political party to legitimize his own illegitimate regime. He had taken power by force and ran the country under a military dictatorship. And this is where the contrast comes in. When it comes to the question of political dynasty, of leadership, the quality of the leadership is something that cannot be taught. It is not something that you can take classes on. It is something that you learn inherently. People such as myself and my colleagues here, we have interned in politics and leadership all our lives. We have watched some of the most important decisions of our country's history being made. We have often had input on those decisions. And that is where bad leadership confers the same bad traits to their dynasties. When our opposition has come to power, in a democracy they have, our country has unfortunately gone backwards. Their governance has been characterized by attempts at election rigging. Every time our opposition party, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, has been in power, every single election they have conducted has been rigged. We, the Awami League, have had to fight them in order to get a free and fair election. In fact, the only constitutional transfer of power Bangladesh has had in its history was at the end of the Awami League's term in 2001. Never beyond that has Bangladesh had a constitutional transfer of power through an election. Bangladesh, during our opposition's term, especially their last term, became synonymous with terrorism. It became known as the most corrupt country in the world, ultimately leading to yet another military takeover. And that really brings me to the story of how I got involved. You see, I had absolutely no interest in politics. I got into trouble with my wife because of this. Before we were married, she asked me, do you have any interest, do you plan to go back to Bangladesh and get involved in politics? And my response was absolutely not. I have absolutely no interest. No interest in politics. Let me tell you, she never lets me forget that to this day. You see, what happened was, after the 2001 elections, there was a wave, which our opposition won. There was a wave of atrocities that were committed against especially the minority voters in our country, because the minorities tend to vote for us, the Awami League. We are much more democratic, we are much more secular. We are the only large secular party in Bangladesh. And I remember in 2001, and this really was the turning point for me personally. I remember reading in the newspaper a story about a 10-month-old Hindu baby girl. She was snatched from her mother's arms and thrown on a fire by BNP cadres. And this was published in the newspaper. And she died in hospital several days later. And that story made me very, very angry. And subsequently, there were many more stories like that. Other children, minority children, snatched from their parents, thrown on fires and burnt alive. A Hindu family locked in their house, and the house set on fire, and burnt alive. Just a wave of atrocities. And this was ultimately what angered me and motivated me to get involved. You see, I've always had this belief that, in the old saying, that evil succeeds when good men do nothing. And so I could not stand by and do nothing. I got involved campaigning to bring awareness internationally and in Bangladesh on these issues, to fight then government. I made it my goal to get them out of power, to make sure that they were thrown out and that such incidents never happened again in Bangladesh. Of course, subsequently things got worse and I became more involved, but and things went from bad to worse. I went back to Bangladesh. I started campaigning in the media at the time when they were trying to rig the elections. And my goal again was to stop that rigged election. And unfortunately, in trying to stop that, it gave the military an opportunity to come in. My plan was, well, once we get democracy back, once we stop this, the atrocities, and get our rights back, then I could go back to my peaceful life. But yet again, that was delayed. And so this, and ultimately, we did not succeed until finally the elections of December 2008, and I'm happy to say Bangladesh has made a remarkable turnaround. I have been able to pacify my wife and go back to leading my nice, quiet life. I still travel back and forth. But ultimately, that is something that never goes away. You stay ever vigilant. And I can't speak for well, I hope I've drawn some of the contrast with the other dynasty in Bangladesh, and I can't speak for their intentions in the future. But I can tell you, as far as my family is concerned, as far as I'm concerned, that we will never allow the rights of the people of Bangladesh to be taken away. We will never allow violence to come into the lives of Bangladeshis ever again. That we will do whatever, my family and I, we will do whatever it takes to stop terrorists, to stop those who would take away our democratic rights, to stop gangsters stop weapons being smuggled in for terrorists and terrorist attacks. And my family and I will always be there to defend Bangladesh, to fight for the people of Bangladesh, as long as we can. With that, I would like to thank you and the India Today group for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I now invite Kalikesh to address us now?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. When we talk of dynasties, we have to realize that dynasties are not unique to Indian politics, as has been mentioned by Saurabh when he introduced us. You have it in Japan, you have it in the USA, developed industrialized countries, educated voters, and yet you had the Clintons, Bushes, Kennedys, many more examples in Japan. They are also not unique to just politics in India. If you look across the spectrum, so-called professions which are more knowledgeable, more service-oriented, disciplined, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, they exist. Even in publicly held business companies, you'd find promoters, their children taking over the mantle of the management. Is that necessarily a bad thing? That's what we're trying to question here. Does that in any way stifle those organizations or institutions? Does it in any way reflect on the merits of those individuals concerned? That's what we really need to look at when we ask that question. Political dynasties in India are not new. However, if you were to look at maybe the percentage of successful hereditary actors as a percentage of the whole, I think you'd find more hereditary actors in Bollywood today than you would find hereditary MPs in Lok Sabha or Rajya Sabha. The good ones succeed. The ones who don't do well, don't. In the recently held UP elections, you've had a case of at least 2 young political members from influential families who've been head-on. One has succeeded, the other has failed. 5 years ago, 3 years ago, the other had succeeded. The Congress has done really well there. Would we like to believe that it's just the surname or the families that has actually caused this? After all, Mayawati was the chief minister 5 years ago. She ran the state government, one of the first few chief ministers of UP to actually have a full majority in the state. For me personally, when I started talking about politics, thinking about politics, much like my eminent panelists here, I was introduced to politics at a very early age. At the age of 5, I remember sitting on my grandmother's lap campaigning for my father for an election which he lost. I did consecutive 5 or 6 elections after that. And I remember very vividly that when I was about 12 or 13, just coming back from my first year in boarding school, we were driving at night, because at that time there was, the cars didn't have air conditioned, so we used to drive at night in the summers. And my car stopped outside a village, somewhere en route between Bhubaneswar and Balangir. 3 in the morning, roads were not very safe, no idea what to do. We walked across to the village. And the entire village woke up at night, extremely happy to find out, once they found out who we were, welcomed us into their homes, gave us hot milk, and talked about what my grandfather had done for them, what my father had done for them. To me, it was a realization of the level of expectation the people in that area had of me, of my family. To me, it was a responsibility. Of course, the fact that I was my father's son helped me get a ticket, maybe access to an organization of party workers, political workers, which others would have had to work much harder for. But I fought an election. I fought my first election as an MLA, won by 3,500 votes. A very, very small margin indeed, from a seat where nobody in my family had ever fought for. I fought my next election in the parliament, and from that assembly constituency, I won by 25,000 votes. That to me is a vindication, not of my family name, but of the work and of the policies that my party had introduced and the work that I had attempted to carry forward. Of course, political families create a platform for young politicians to enter. It could be financial resources. It could be an organization. It could be the brand recall of a family name. All of this helps. And this is not unique to India. This exists globally. But the second reason, which I believe is very unique to India, is the fact that many times in India, we vote on the basis of identities, be it caste, Dalits, Jatavs, Brahmins. It exists predominantly in northern India, be it on the basis of religion, Hindu, Muslim, Christians, be it on the basis of lingual identity, Marathas versus non-Marathas, Karnatakas versus non-Karnatakas, be it on the basis of political families, political individuals, prominent political individuals. Whenever you vote on identities, you will see that these identities tend to translate and hinge on individuals which act as poster boys for these identities. You look at Bal Thackeray in Maharashtra, you look at Mayawati, and now Akhilesh in UP. In many of our prominent politicians, you find a link between identities and individual families coming up and carrying forward that legacy. Is that a bad thing? Is that a boon or a curse, as this topic's debate calls it? Not necessarily. After all, democracy means the freedom of choice. If individuals want to vote on the basis of identities, if voters want to vote on the basis of a family name, should we not give them the freedom of choice? The question we really have to answer is whether that is the only criteria for voting or not. If that is the only criteria for voting, yes, it will be a curse. I am not so worried about it in India. I have seen a number of my friends, my colleagues, my family members who come from very prominent political families who have lost elections, recently in Punjab, recently in UP, my state of Orissa. Obviously, it's not just the family name. It's not just the dynasties in politics that dominate the Indian voting pattern. But what is worrying to me, and what I am a little alarmed about, is the control political families have on the inner democracies of political parties. The fragmentation of Indian polity, the number of regional parties coming up, controlled by individuals who tend to create a cult-like situation, and the absence, in some cases absolute absence, of inner democracy workings in those political parties will or could at times lead to a situation where the leader who belongs to that prominent family is not able to carry the voters forward. Yet, he will not allow another leader to rise from in that political party, and therefore stifling and suffocating that party. I've been asked to make it very short. I know you have a lot of questions to ask here. I think at the end of the day, political dynasties are not incompatible with democracy. They exist. But I think somewhere along the line, I have confidence, at least in electoral politics, that voters know what's right and what's wrong, and they know how to differentiate. I have faith in them. I hope you do. Thank you.
Thanks, Kalikesh. Well, it seems from what our panelists spoke today, you require something more than a dynasty. You require something like a dynasty plus approach to succeed in politics today. You can't just rely on your family name. Yes, family name gives you a fast-track route, but you need to do something more. We're already running out of time. As a moderator, I'll just take quick questions from the three panelists, beginning with you, Namal. Namal, there is a sense that you've been tipped to become the president of Sri Lanka. You've been groomed by your father, because the sense is this is a way of your government. Your father believes that that's a way to have you have an untainted record, to do away with the human right, the human rights criticism that your government is getting globally. That's a way to project you to make sure that you get a global recognition and more acceptance than the present government. Your response?
Well, first of all, I must emphasize the fact that the LTT, terrorist organization, was defeated only 3 years ago. And it is after 3 years that you hear, you see a lot of stories about what was going on. So what, as Sri Lankans, what we always say, as what we always believe is that we should have a homegrown system to make sure that the people of Sri Lanka get what they should be getting, irrespective of what language, what caste they belong to, or what religion they believe in. And at the same time, as a country, what we need is time and space. Because within 3 years, you cannot do reconciliation. As you know, there are examples in Sri Lanka as well, where in the region as well, where it takes time for reconciliation. And about the fact whether the dynasties are going to continue or not, it all depends on the people. If people, it's choice of people. And if people decide it, then we all respect it. So we come and go. The politicians, the families, they might be in power today and they might not be in power tomorrow. But the country has to remain, the Sri Lankans has to remain, and they all have to live in the single platform of Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Sajib, you've been talking about religious extremism in your country. We saw a lot of prominent, speakers, we called Salman Rushdie and, people like Imran Khan, they had a different view. But you are a courageous person. You decided to go ahead and be here. What is your sense? Do you think that by actions like these, you're actually strengthening the hands of the religious extremists in countries like yours and in South Asia?
Absolutely. Bangladesh, we have always believed, we've always considered ourselves a secular country with a Muslim majority. We have a majority religion, but our belief is that we must live in harmony with all. And in religion, you are going to have differing viewpoints. So by taking an extreme stance, all you are doing is furthering extremism. And so in Bangladesh, unfortunately, our opposition party, which is right of center, they fomented the extremism. They used the extremists to their own political ends. And Bangladesh moved towards being a failed state. This is what gave rise, this intolerance is what gave rise to terrorists. It gave scope, it gave space for the terrorists to operate and exist. Whereas if you promote the tolerance, as we are doing now, you can deny space to the terrorists. We have been, when our government came back, many people doubted whether we would actually be able to contain terrorism and stop it. And I'm proud to say that we did. We stopped it dead in its tracks.
One last question to Kalikesh. Kalikesh, you have family members across political parties. How do you reconcile these political differences when you meet at home? How do you manage to keep the family together?
Well, that's really difficult because I fought against a family member in my election. Political differences are very difficult to reconcile. You tend to leave politics out of family matters, if that's possible at all. At the end of the day, you follow what you really believe in. And different parties have different ideologies, and I follow mine.
Thank you. We had a good rocking session. Unfortunately, we could not take more questions because we are running out of time. Thank you very much for being here today.